Why do brides mysteriously vanish on their wedding night in this village? Could there be a dark secret behind it? Watch now to uncover this story. The village of Sembora, once known for its lively marriage celebrations, had fallen into a heavy silence. The laughter and joy that used to fill the air during wedding feasts had been replaced by whispers and fearful glances. Each marriage that should have brought hope now brought sorrow. Brides, full of life one day, vanished without a trace the next. All that remained was a torn piece of fabric near the village's edge, fluttering like the last breath of a lost dream. The elders dismissed the growing fear with cold words. They simply run away. But Zainab knew better. She had heard the stories, felt the unease. The village had always been a place where tradition ruled and silence was sacred. Women dared not speak of their fears. They obeyed as they had been taught. But the fear that spread through the village was no longer something that could be ignored. The stories of the vanishing brides were too frequent, the absence too deep to be brushed aside. Zainab, 22 years old, had always been different. She had inherited her mother's intelligence and her father's boldness. Her marriage had been arranged like all the others. But unlike the others, Zainab's heart did not bow to tradition. She feared for her life, for her freedom. If the others had disappeared without a trace, who was to say she would not be next? The thought gripped her heart each night, keeping her awake, her thoughts swirling in a cloud of doubt. Baba Malu, the respected elder of the village, spoke little, but when he did, his words held weight. He was the voice of tradition, the keeper of secrets, and when asked about the missing brides, he simply shook his head. "It is not for women to question what they do not understand," he said, his voice low and firm. "They vanish, perhaps, by choice, perhaps by fate. What does it matter?" Zainab's heart stirred with anger and confusion. How could the elders be so dismissive? Why was no one asking the questions that burned at her own soul? But Baba Malu had been the village's guide for as long as anyone could remember, his word the final one. To question him was to risk disgrace, to risk everything. Ayo, Zainab's childhood friend, was not so easily swayed. Unlike the others, Ayo had always been a man of observation. He had seen the strange movements on wedding nights, the way men would slip into the shadows, the muffled cries that hung in the air, and the footprints that led into the darkened forest. Ayo's eyes had seen what others refused to acknowledge. "It's not what they say," he muttered one evening, his voice heavy with suspicion. "I saw them, Zainab. I saw the men moving toward the forest the night after the last wedding. It wasn't just an accident. There's something wrong here." Zainab felt a shiver run down her spine. Ayo's words echoed her own fears, yet the village had turned a blind eye to them. And even more unsettling, she realized that no one had ever spoken of the disappearances in a way that felt true. "We can't just sit here and wait for it to happen to us," Zainab whispered, her voice trembling with determination. Her older sister, Halima, had a different fear. She had seen what happened to those who questioned the village's ways. Halima had lost her best friend to the vanishing brides, and she warned Zainab time and again. "Leave, Zainab," Halima urged, her voice tinged with sorrow. "Before it's too late. The ones who ask too many questions, sometimes they disappear as well." But Zainab would not run. She could not. The women of Sembora had gone missing, never to be heard from again. If they had truly run away, why had none of them ever returned? The questions kept rising in her chest, and she knew in her heart that the truth had been buried beneath the village's silence. She was determined to find it, to bring it to light, no matter the cost. Zainab walked through the quiet paths of Sembora, each step heavy with the weight of the village's silence. She had visited many of the homes of the vanished brides, but each one felt like stepping into a graveyard. The mothers, still mourning their daughters, sat in their small homes, their eyes hollow with the loss they could never speak of. In every home, the same grief lingered like a dark cloud. The air felt thick with it. "Did she say anything before she left?" Zainab asked one mother, her voice soft with compassion. The woman shook her head slowly, as if to deny the truth, but her eyes told another story. "She didn't want to leave. She cried the night before." The mother whispered, her voice trembling. "She was happy, until they came for her." Zainab's heart sank. She had heard this same story from every home, from every mother. None of the missing women had run away. None had left of their own will. And yet, the elders and the men of the village continued to spin their lies, hiding the truth behind the veil of tradition. Zainab clenched her fists. The truth was clear now. These women had been stolen. No one could deny it any longer. In the quiet of the evening, Zainab entered the home of one of the vanished brides. The room had been left undisturbed, as if the woman might return at any moment. It was here, hidden beneath a pile of discarded cloth, that Zainab found the letter. Its ink was smudged, the words barely legible, but the message was clear enough to make her blood run cold. "They come when the moon is high. Beware the ones you trust." Her heart pounded. The enemy wasn't some distant force, it was already within the village, hiding behind familiar faces. Zainab's hands shook as she folded the letter and tucked it into her dress. She knew now that she was no longer just a bride-to-be. She was a woman on a mission, and she would not rest until she knew the truth. Later, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Zainab met Ayo by the edge of the village. His face was tight with concern, and he moved quickly, as if fearing someone might overhear. "I need to speak with you," he said in a low voice. "What's wrong?" Zainab asked, her heart thudding. Ayo looked around, then lowered his voice further. "I saw something," he began. "A few nights ago, after the last wedding, I was out hunting near the forest. I saw men, more than a few, leading horses toward the trees. And then I saw something that made my gut twist. Wedding beads. They were on the ground, scattered, like they had been pulled from a bride's neck." Zainab felt a cold wave wash over her. "The men, they were from the village?" Ayo nodded grimly. "Yes, I recognized them. They weren't strangers, but they moved like shadows, as if they didn't want anyone to see them." The pieces were starting to fall into place. The moonlit paths, the whispers, the vanishing brides. And now, Ayo's discovery. The men weren't just carrying out some cruel plan, they were part of it. The next day, Zainab could no longer remain silent. She went to Baba Malu, her heart racing with the weight of the questions she had been holding in. He sat in his customary place, his gaze stern, his silence unnerving. "Why have the brides disappeared, Baba Malu?" she demanded, her voice firm but respectful. He looked at her with a coldness that made her spine tingle. "It is not for you to question the ways of our village, child," he said, his voice calm at first. But Zainab could see the anger rising in his eyes. "You're playing with fire," he growled. "Ask no more questions, or you may not live to see your wedding day." His warning hung in the air like the stillness before a storm. Zainab felt a chill run through her, but she stood her ground. Baba Malu was hiding something. She could see it in his eyes, in the way his hands clenched. The truth was within his reach, and he was trying to bury it. But Zainab would not be silenced. That night, after another wedding feast, Zainab and Halima sneaked away under the cover of darkness. Their hearts beat in their chests like wild birds, but neither spoke. They had no words for the fear that gripped them. The path they followed was hidden well, known only to those who sought what others dared not find. With each step, the ground beneath them seemed to pulse with anticipation. The night was thick with the sounds of the village celebrating, but Zainab's mind was elsewhere. She was searching for something, and the path was leading her to a place where secrets lay buried. Finally, after what felt like hours, they reached the edge of the forest. In the distance, Zainab saw them. A group of masked men stood near a waiting horse, their figures moving in silence. In the light of their flickering torches, Zainab could see a young bride bound tightly and trembling, forced onto the horse. The men moved with unsettling familiarity, too familiar. Zainab's heart skipped a beat. She could not look away. One of the masked men turned, and the firelight caught his face. Baba Malu. Her breath caught in her throat. The realization was like a slap. Baba Malu, the elder who had always upheld tradition, the one who had silenced every question, was one of them. He was part of the darkness that had taken these women. Her hand clenched around the letter, and she knew in that moment that her path had been set. There was no turning back now. The village's greatest secret had been exposed, and Zainab would make sure that no woman would ever be taken again. Zainab could barely breathe as she hid behind the thick brush, her heart pounding against her chest like the drums at a festival. Her eyes were fixed on the men she had once respected, now leading the trembling brides, women bound with ropes, their hands tied tightly behind their backs. The moonlight cast a cold glow on their faces, but it did nothing to hide their fear. The men were not strangers to the village. They were fathers, brothers, uncles. They were the very men who stood proudly at the center of the village, leaders of the community. Zainab's mind raced as she heard one of the men speak in a hushed voice, the words seeping through the night like poison. "They'll fetch a good price," the man said. "We'll sell them to the merchants in the city. The wealthy men will pay handsomely for young brides." Zainab's breath caught in her throat. The truth hit her like a sharp stone, cutting deep into her soul. The elders, the ones who had guided the village for generations, were selling the young women to wealthy men from distant lands. The brides weren't running away. They were being stolen, sold like cattle. The betrayal ran deeper than she could ever have imagined. Her hands trembled as she struggled to stay hidden, but she knew she could not let this go unnoticed. She had to act. Just as she made to leave, a rustling sound from behind startled her. She turned, heart leaping into her throat. A village guard, a man she had once called a friend, stepped forward. His eyes locked with hers, wide with recognition. "Zainab," he shouted. Panic surged within her. She turned and ran, pushing through the underbrush, her legs burning with the effort. The sound of the guard's voice echoed in her ears as she dashed through the trees. Branches whipped against her skin, tearing at her dress, but she didn't care. Her only thought was to escape, to stay alive long enough to bring the truth to the people. She ran until her breath came in sharp gasps, her feet heavy against the ground. The sounds of pursuit grew closer, the voices of the men rising in urgency. She could hear their footsteps crunching through the leaves, their torches casting flickering shadows in the distance. Zainab's body screamed for rest, but she couldn't stop. She had to keep moving. Finally, with nowhere left to run, she stumbled behind an ancient baobab tree, the roots twisted and gnarled, hiding her from view. She pressed herself against the earth, holding her breath as the men passed by, their voices full of anger and confusion. "Where is she?" "Find her," one of the men shouted. Zainab's heart beat so loudly in her chest that she feared they could hear it. She closed her eyes, praying to the ancestors for protection. The night stretched on, endless and cruel, until the first light of dawn crept into the sky and the sounds of pursuit began to fade. Only then did Zainab allow herself to breathe again. Exhausted, shaken, and covered in dirt, Zainab finally made her way to Ayo's compound. She stumbled through the entrance, her knees weak, her body trembling with fear and anger. Ayo, who had been working in the fields, looked up in surprise. His face quickly changed from curiosity to concern when he saw the state she was in. "Ayo," Zainab gasped, her voice breaking. I've seen it all. The truth at the elders, they are selling the brides to wealthy men. They've been stealing them. They're not running away, Ayo. They're being sold like property." Ayo's face went pale. He moved quickly to her side, pulling her into his arms. "Zainab, you should have stayed hidden. They'll come for you next." "I couldn't." "Stay hidden, Ayo," Zainab replied, her voice fierce despite the fear in her chest. "If we stay hidden, they will keep taking more women. We cannot live in fear any longer. We must fight back." Ayo looked at her, his brow furrowed in concern. "But Zainab, the elders, they are powerful. They control everything. If we go against them, they will destroy us." Zainab pulled away from him, her eyes burning with determination. "I will not be another lost bride. I will not let the others disappear without a trace. We will not run. We will rise." She stood tall, her back straight with the weight of her resolve. "I will go to the families. I will tell them what I saw. We will fight, Ayo. We will bring the truth to the village and we will make them listen." Ayo's eyes softened with worry, but he nodded. "I will stand by you, Zainab. Whatever comes, we will face it together." With Ayo's support, Zainab set out to gather the grieving families. She spoke to them one by one, her voice filled with the fire of truth. Slowly, the silence that had once gripped the village began to crack. The mothers, the fathers, the sisters and the brothers, all the ones who had lost their loved ones, began to rise together. The silent voices of the village that had been buried for so long were finally speaking out. "We will not be silent anymore," Zainab declared to the gathered families. "We will not let fear rule us. We will stand together, and we will make them pay for what they've done." The wind began to pick up, and the first drops of rain began to fall from the sky. It was as if the earth itself was responding to Zainab's words. The village had been sleeping for too long, but now it was waking. And with it, a storm was coming, one that would bring justice for the stolen brides, one that would shatter the lies of the elders. Zainab stood tall, her heart full of hope for the first time in many days. She had made her decision. The fight for the truth had begun. Zainab stood tall in the center of the village square, her heart steady but her voice trembling with emotion. The villagers, drawn by the murmurs of unrest, gathered in silence, their faces filled with curiosity and uncertainty. Baba Malu stood at the front, his arms crossed, a smirk playing on his lips. He was the one who had silenced them all for years, and now his arrogance filled the air like smoke. Zainab took a deep breath, steadying herself. "Listen to me," she began, her voice carrying the weight of truth. "For too long, we have lived in silence. For too long, our daughters have been taken from us, sold to strangers in far-off lands, while the men we trusted, our elders, betrayed us." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some faces turned pale in shock, others tightened with anger. Zainab felt the eyes of her people upon her, the weight of her words heavy on her shoulders. She had to be strong. "I saw them," she continued, her voice rising. "I saw the men, the ones who call themselves leaders, leading our daughters away in the dead of night. I saw them sell our women like cattle for gold and silver, and I know they did it with Baba Malu's blessing." Baba Malu's smirk faltered, his eyes narrowing. "You are young, girl," he said with a laugh, his voice cold. "You are confused by your own imagination. What you speak is nonsense." The crowd grew restless. Some villagers lowered their eyes, unwilling to face the truth, but others were beginning to listen. Zainab's heart beat faster as she pressed on. "I am not confused," she said firmly. "I have seen it with my own eyes, and I am not alone. I have spoken to the families of the missing brides. They know the truth. The only ones who are confused are those who still choose to believe in the lies." For a moment, the square fell silent. Then, from the back of the crowd, a voice rose. "She speaks the truth." It was a woman, one of the mothers whose daughter had been taken. The crowd gasped. "And I too have seen it," another voice cried out. "My daughter was taken, and I never understood why she never returned. But now I know. She was stolen, sold for money." One by one, villagers stepped forward, their voices uniting in a chorus of anger and truth. Zainab's heart swelled with hope. The silence that had held them captive for so long was breaking. The truth was no longer something whispered in the shadows. It was spoken loud and clear, and the village was no longer afraid. Baba Malu's face twisted with rage. "You will regret this," he growled. "You have no idea what you are doing." But Zainab stood firm, her eyes locked on his. "No, Baba Malu, you are the one who will regret this. The time for silence is over. The time for justice is now." As the villagers rallied behind Zainab, the guilty men, those who had thought they could escape, began to move toward the edge of the crowd, trying to flee into the forest. But the younger men, led by Ayo, had been waiting for this moment. They moved swiftly, blocking the path. The once proud leaders of the village were no longer in control. They were the ones who would be dragged away, not the women. Baba Malu tried to push past the younger men, his face contorted with fear and fury. But Ayo and the others seized him, pulling him to the ground. "You cannot run," Ayo said, his voice strong. "Not this time." As the elders were dragged through the village, their wealth and influence no longer mattered. The villagers, once held in fear by the power of these men, now watched in silence, their faces marked with a mixture of relief and anger. The time for justice had come, and it would not be stopped. Zainab's heart swelled as the message was sent to the regional authorities. The elders would face their punishment, and the truth would spread beyond the village. The women, those who had been stolen, would be found. Some would return, but others would remain lost to distant lands. The villagers would never forget them, and they would fight to ensure that no other woman would suffer the same fate. In the days that followed, Zainab stood before the village, her head held high. The marriage that had been arranged for her was no longer something she would accept. She had no need for a man to tell her what to do. She had a village to rebuild, a future to create, and a truth to preserve. She chose her own path. "I will stay," Zainab declared. "I will fight for this village. I will fight for the women of Sembora, and I will ensure that no one else is taken, no one else is silenced." The villagers, once divided by fear, now stood united. They knew that the fight was not over. There would be more battles ahead, but for the first time in many years, they were not alone. They were a community, bound by truth and justice. As the weeks passed, the village began to heal. The stolen brides were rescued, some returning to their families, while others remained lost. But Zainab's voice, strong and unwavering, led them forward. She had rewritten the story of Sembora, and in doing so had rewritten the lives of its people. Under the great baobab tree, the elders and families gathered once more. The tree, once a symbol of silence, now stood as a reminder of change. The lesson was hard-earned, but it was clear. True tradition, the villagers learned, must evolve. It must protect the weak as much as the strong, and it must ensure that no one is silenced. Zainab stood before them, her heart full of pride. She had fought for her people, and now she would help them rebuild. As the sun rose over Sembora, it was not just the dawn of a new day. It was the dawn of a new tradition. one where justice and truth would always find their place. Zainab's bravery proved that one person's courage could spark change. She risked everything by speaking out, breaking the silence that had kept the village bound. Her voice was the spark, igniting a fire of resistance. Change begins with those who dare to speak, even when no one listens at first.